Hi, I'm Michael Rosen and I'm sitting in my garden at home and I'm going to read some poems to you, and as I read them to you I'm going to make some suggestions of things that you can write, and also I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to write the poems. So this comes from a book called On the Move, Poems About Migration. You probably know that word, migration. It just really means moving. And we all migrate, we all move one place to another. Sometimes we move from one country to another. Sometimes we move whole continents. We go from one side of the world to another. But then sometimes we just move houses. I've not really moved very far in my life. I've moved from one place in North London to another place in North London to another place in North London to another place in North London. It's not very far, is it? I sometimes think I'm just like a hand of a clock going round the top of North London. But other people move lots of different places. And then when I look back in my family, and I find all sorts of really big movements, like, well, my dad, he came to this country from America. So that's quite a long way, but he was only 2, so he didn't really remember that. And then I found out that his uncles and aunts, some of them were in America, some of them were in France, and some of them were in Poland. That's on my dad's side of the family. And then on my mum's side of the family, it was her grandparents. They moved from Poland and Russia and places like that. So suddenly, though I'm not really what people call a migrant, though I have moved, I found all these migrants in my family. And that's what I've written about in my book On the Move. So I'm going to read some poems. And as I read them, I want you to think about sort of things that you could write about. And you see, I've marked in my book the poems that I'm going to read to you. And I actually wrote a little thing at the beginning of the book about poetry itself, because I think poetry is a migrant. Poetry moves. So I wrote, poetry is the migrant. It travels. Poetry is the witness. It listens. Poetry is the survivor. It lasts. So there we are. That's for you to think about while we're talking about these poems. So I'm going to begin with the fact that my parents could speak another language. That quite often happens when people migrate. And my mum and dad could speak a language called Yiddish that some Jewish people speak, particularly those who started out life in Eastern Europe. That's the east side of Europe, yeah? So you'll be able to join in with some of this. My mum can speak 2 languages and sometimes mixes them up. She doesn't say, don't moan. She says, don't kvetch. She doesn't say, don't slurp your soup. She says, don't chup. She doesn't say, don't burp. She says, don't graps. She doesn't say, don't fart. She says, don't fots. And when I have wrinkles in my socks, she says, it looks like I've put my feet through a pile of bagels. So she says, take the bagels out of your socks. So I sing it all back to her. Don't kvetch, don't chup, don't graps, don't fots. Take the bagels out of your socks. And we all sing it. Don't kvetch, don't chup, don't graps, don't fots. Take the bagels out of your socks. Now maybe some of you, maybe your mums and dads say words or use words and you wonder about them, and maybe they come from other countries, or maybe they come from another part of Britain or Ireland or somewhere, and it makes you think about them. So there's an idea for a poem that you put those words in a poem. I mean, I can remember when my mum, she'd say, oh look, you've got to do the drying up, Michael. Take the schmutter and dry up. And that's what I thought was the English word for the drying up cloth, schmutter. So I went to school and I was talking to my friends and I said, hey, you know when you're drying up with the schmutter? And they went, what? You know, with the schmutter. And they said, what's a schmutter? I said, the thing you dry up with. They said, no, that's called a tea towel, Michael. So I went home and I said, Mum, the friends at school, they say it's called a tea towel. And Mum said, no, it's a schmutter. Thanks, Mum. She came into my room And she said, this place is a Michelin. I said, what's a Michelin? She said, this room, and walked out. It's mysterious, isn't it? So maybe you could think of some words that your mums and dads, or maybe your grandparents, someone else in your family, and see whether you can make up a little poem using words that they use. Yeah? So there's my first idea. Now what about when you find out that people have come from another country in your family? What things do they bring? Here's a poem about that. My father came to England from another country. My father's mother came to England from another country. But my father's father stayed behind. So my dad had no dad here, and I never saw him at all. One day in spring, some things arrived. A few old papers, a few old photos, and oh yes, a hulky, bulky, thick checked jacket that belonged to the man I would have called Grandad. The man who stayed behind. The man who stayed behind. But I kept that jacket, and I wore it, and I wore it, and I wore it, till it wore right through at the back. So that's a poem about travel and migration, but something to do with things connected to mum or dad. In this case, it's my dad, isn't it? My father, and to his father. So you could think maybe about that in your family, some object. It could be a jacket, could be a jewel, maybe it's a bracelet or a ring or something like that. Yeah? And you could make a poem up about that. Now I want to read you a poem about the grandparent, the grandmum, who we used to call Grandma. And she was the one who lived for a long time in America. So she travelled to this country on a great big boat called the SS President Harding. So I'm going to read you this poem now. Here we go. A ship in a bottle sails down the mantelpiece. A ship in a photo brings Grandma here. Ships they talk and talk about. Ships far and near. How did the ship get in the bottle? Ships by night and by day. Ships they talk and talk about. Why did Grandma come to stay? Who put the ship in the bottle? Ships that they once knew. Ships they talk and talk about. Why didn't Grandad come too? When did the ship go in the bottle? Ships sailing far and near. Ships they talk and talk about. Who else didn't come here? Who broke the ship in the bottle? Can anyone tell me why? Ships they talk and talk about. And why did the baby die? And maybe you can hear an aeroplane. And that reminds me, sometimes, of course, we travel by plane, don't we? And you can have the sound of an aeroplane in your poem. Just like I've got pictures. I say there's photos, don't I? There's photos of a ship in a photo. Maybe you could have the sound of an aeroplane, and you could think about someone in your family. You see what I've done there? What I've done is I've taken the ship in the bottle that used to be on the mantelpiece, and then that's taken me thinking about the ships and the ship that Grandma's come on. I could think, of course, about the ship that my dad travelled on all the way to America when he was a baby, and then think about that, you see. So the idea of ships that in the room and then ships at sea, that's what you can do with objects. One object takes you to another one, you see. So let's see, I'll do one more before we stop, and this is about what I sometimes call impossible writing. Today, the rain has died, my shoes have died, the sun has died, my coat has died, the earth has died today. One day, the rain will flower, my shoes will laugh, the sun will sing, my coat will fly, the earth will dance one day. Now that's what I call impossible writing. So what you can do with another kind of writing is you think of things that are real, like me sitting on the chair or sitting on this bench. But instead of say, I'm sitting on the bench, I could say, the bench is holding me, or the bench is holding me up. Well, it isn't, is it? Because I'm sitting on it. But I'm talking about impossible writing. And sometimes things are sad or tragic or very strange, and impossible writing is good writing to use. So with this poem, I was actually thinking about my relatives. So at the beginning I told you that some of my relatives were in France and some of them were in Poland, and they nearly all died. They nearly all got killed during the Second World War for being Jewish. So really what I was imagining there was something that was terrible, but also something that was hopeful. And I used impossible writing to do it. So I'm going to read it to you one more time, and please steal my ideas. You think of something like it. Today, the rain has died, my shoes have died, the sun has died, my coat has died, the earth has died today. One day, the rain will flower, my shoes will laugh, the sun will sing, my coat will fly, the earth will dance one day. So there's something you can use. I've used the idea of today, one day, but you could use day and night. Sometimes we think of night as a bit, a bit scary, and day as a bit hopeful. So you could write impossible, possible, if you like, something like that, using that way of writing. And you could think of other things. I had rain, shoes, sun, coat, and earth, didn't I? Well, you could think of some other things and think of an impossible thing that's happened. And maybe it can express something that's happened in your family that was sad and that people have overcome. Yes? There's lots of possibilities. That's always the thing about poems, is they're often about possibilities, things that are possible. So I hope you have a good time doing some writing. That's all for now.